this is tobacco. Beautiful plant. Tobacco is. We shouldn't think of this as beautiful, actually, because it's an example of what we call monocropping. And we've been trained to believe this is beautiful and having all of these plants in rows and nicely cultivated, but in fact, it makes them very susceptible to pests and plagues and diseases and depletes the soil and all those things. But the reason I want to talk about tobacco is the question of, okay, so you have Richard Lee going off to the Kalahari and talking to the people there, and he won't give them food, but they're all sitting around smoking, which was a very important thing that anthropologists did in the old days when people would go to other places. We'd sit around and pass around tobacco and smoke with people, which is, of course, a traditional crop of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. It's a gift from the Native Americans to the world, but how did they get it in all these places, like in the Kalahari Desert? And we could equally reflect on how the people in the U.S. plains got their horses. And again, we have all these anthropologists who went into the plains that would talk about how skilled the indigenous people or the Native Americans were on riding horseback and being able to shoot guns from the back of horses and all those things. But in fact, we know that horses, we saw that in domesticated animals, were something that comes to us from Eurasia. How was it that the peoples of the U.S. plains got their horses and got to be so skilled with the horses and the guns? And the answer to that has to do with something that is called the Columbian Exchange, which is kind of a strange label for a lot of things that happened after the encounter between the Americas and Eurasia, after these two continents came back together. Some of it was done by trade and exchange, and certainly something like tobacco was planted around the world, and things like horses were probably traded out in front of the Europeans. They were either captured or bought, and then people probably in the Americas saw horses long before they ever saw actual European explorers, because these things travel ahead of people and get incorporated into people's societies and cultures. But we have this huge transformation in which a number of plant crops come from the Americas into the Old World, and a number of the large domesticated animals come from the Eurasia into the Americas. And we also have a massive human movement of people of enslaved Africans who were mostly, as we talked about, brought to the Americas to cultivate sugar and to cultivate sugar cane, which would then be processed and shipped back into Europe. And this is, we can look at it. It's really a great map I want to give credit to Simeon Netchev, who did the freelance writing and designing of this map and is available on Google for anyone. But you can really study kind of the ways in which this so-called exchange took place, and was really one of the biggest demographic people movements and transformations in history. And it resulted in an incredible diet transformation, the results of which we're still feeling today. In the 18th century, in the 1700s, in Europe, people would drink a little bit of beer or a little bit of wine all day long, and they would do their tasks and their agricultural stuff. This is from a book whose title is great. The book itself is kind of a little less exciting, but it's called From Silver to Cocaine, which talks about the influence of the Americas and Latin America in world trade. But what happens is that as Europeans become industrialized, they don't want people drinking a little bit of alcohol all day long. But this was kind of the way life was done. My own great-grandfather, who was of Italian heritage in this country, my dad still talks about how they would go and get a large barrel of wine back when people in the United States weren't really wine drinkers, and he'd put a little bit in his coffee in the morning and a little bit at lunch and a little bit at dinner. And he was never drunk, but hey, sorry, were you confused by the email too? No, I did not realize I had made that mistake in the email. Why can't I get to the test? Yeah. See, I thought I had announced all that stuff on Friday, but then I sent out a bad email. So there we go. We've been talking here about the movement of sugar and people from the old world into the Americas and the Columbian Exchange. And we started off with a couple questions like, why did the people in the Kalahari like tobacco so much, which was a Native American thing, and why did the people in the plains, how did the plains people in the United States, indigenous people, get their horses? And so this kind of world trade that was going on. And we were talking about how this is a limited, or I mean, it was an incredible diet transformation in that in the olden days, people drank a little bit of wine or beer all day long, which was probably relatively nutritious for them. In fact, my great-grandfather, who was drinking a little bit of wine all day long, lived to be the oldest of any of us. He lived to be 101 years old, so it worked for him. But as people got in, they wanted them to do factory jobs, and instead of having wine breaks or beer breaks, which are good for agricultural work, but not perhaps so good for the factories, you wanted people to be more on the clock. And so basically what people started doing in the UK and in England, they had their tea, which is heavily sugared, and then in France and Italy, they became coffee drinkers, again, heavily sugared, and eventually then they figured out how to hook up chocolate to sugar as well, and that changed things a lot. We talked about this a bit before in terms of the Aztecs and all of the places of origin of tea and of coffee and of cacao, chocolate. These were things that were not consumed with sugar. So that was the innovation, was to put in all this sugar. And because of the ways in which the sugarcane plantations, the massive importation of enslaved Africans into the Americas, sugar used to be a super exotic kind of spice level, cost a lot of money. So it went from being this exotic luxury to a mass consumer necessity, which is, people needed it in order to work. And I guess especially if you combine that with a cup of sugared coffee and a cigarette, you get a big bump in your productivity from a 15-minute break, at least a bigger bump than if you took a beer break at noon. So what we see is this massive transformation of the diets of people in many different parts of the world, and including in the places that were growing sugar. This has been detailed by the anthropologist Sidney Mintz, one of the most famous books in anthropology, called Sweetness and Power: The Place of Sugar in Modern History. And he details the transformation by which we now get most of our calories now in the United States come from corn syrup, which is the new form of sugarcane. And so we go from the plantation agriculture that was developed in the colonial encounter to what Michael Gonzalez and Camp call industrialized agriculture, the ways in which people started to grow crops and started to monocrop them and to move things long distances in order to consume them. And industrialized agriculture is in many ways much like what plantation agriculture was. And in fact, if you went to Brazil, you would probably look at the coffee growing areas of today. Probably, if you close your eyes, it looks a lot like what was being done on the plantations. Yeah. Is this the first slide? No. Hang on a second. What do I want to do? One of the colleagues of Sidney Mintz was an anthropologist named Eric Wolf. It was actually the first anthropology book I ever read back when I was a first-year student in 1989. This book was called Europe and the People Without History by Eric Wolf. It was published in 1985. And it was and is an incredible book. I don't think I would be an anthropologist if it weren't for reading this. But he made two huge points. And one was that he was describing this world in which people were interconnected to each other. He was talking about the ways in which how the people on the US plains who had been described by anthropologists, these wonderfully skilled horsemen and able to have all these skills with horses and being pastoralists, had acquired those horses by trade initially from Europeans, and then later on trading them themselves, and how people in places as far away as the Kalahari became dependent on things like tobacco as much as any of us. And so he was describing a world of interconnection. The title was in some ways an unfortunate title because he was trying to be a bit ironic in the sense that what he was saying is that Europe assumed that the people that were out there, that were outside of Europe, didn't have history, when in fact he was trying to talk anthropologically and historically about all the places outside of Europe that genuinely did have a history. And he was arguing that it was the people that the Europeans said didn't have history, the people without history, were the ones that had made capitalism and this place called Europe possible, and that had fueled the industrial expansion. We talked about silver, and we talked about sugar, and all the things that were fed into this economy in order to make it run the way it did. Eric Wolf was also kind of famous. Perhaps for me, the most important point was this interconnection and the historical story. He is also associated with something called the modes of production analysis, which very much relates to the kinds of ways in which we saw social organization in this chapter on food and economy. It was influenced by the work of Karl Marx, but it was kind of took it in a more inclusive direction, in a more analytical direction than Marx had taken it. So for Eric Wolf, he described different modes of production as some being ordered by kinship, kin-ordered. And so those are ones that we're familiar with. We talked about foraging or gathering and hunting, and how the importance of kinship ties in those kinds of societies. Horticulture or small-scale agriculture, and herding or pastoralism. that have been relatively egalitarian social organizations organized by reciprocity and kinship. He also describes something that might be marked by what we read about as redistribution, sometimes with leveling mechanisms, but sometimes simply that people are paying taxes or tribute, and that's why he called them tributary modes of production, to a central or an upper ruler. And so in this case, it would be more intensive agriculture or more intensified herding or pastoralism, in which people were asked for some form of tribute, and there were political hierarchies that were established, which were more enduring than the kin-ordered mode of production. And finally, the mode of production which Marx was most interested in, which is the capitalist mode of production, in which things get produced because people will pay for them. And if you don't get money for it, you're not going to produce it. So we talked about production for social needs and trying to evaluate the social needs of a group. And certainly when people produce things in a capitalist society, it's because it's a kind of translation of what we think of as social needs. But the thing is that if people don't have the money to pay for it, even if they need it, as we talked about in the last class, they may need a home, but if they do not have the money, then no one is going to produce that good or that home or that food. And so you have this intensification of production and in some ways an overabundance of certain things, but it's not distributed in a way that many members of society are unable to have adequate food or housing in these economies. Again, like I said, I don't think that the main point is to try and buttonhole all these societies into little boxes. The main point is to talk about how society can be differently ordered, but also how these societies are interconnected and intertwined with each other, and how our economic or food production organization gets entwined with our social life. In terms of what we read in the Kalahari, if we remember that famous quote from the Kalahari via Richard Lee, why should we plant if there are so many mongongo nuts in the world? If the mongongo nuts are just growing out there to be gathered, we don't need to plant anything. Of course, one answer to this, and the way that Lee described it, was that hunter and gatherer economies were not as inefficient as they had been portrayed. That in some ways, they were able to harvest a diverse array of plants and animals and achieve a highly nutritious diet accordingly. However, in the case of the Kalahari, and this is where the anthropology and the history of somebody like Eric Wolfwood might bring us a different kind of story to this. The anthropologist Robert Gordon has written about how in 1912 to 1915, when this area was under German colonial rule, there was something that he describes as the Bushman genocide, in which there were just lots of people who were killed or subjugated during this time. And as he puts it, this has been ignored. It's not seen, it's not remembered. And the only reason that he could that he had access to this is because he grew up in the area and he spoke and read German. And so he looked for this in the archives and the historical material. But the thing is if there were even if there were such large scale atrocities and a genocide in 1912 to 1915 than when Richard Lee was coming in and doing his work in the 1960s. Obviously, and this is a sort of brutal way to say it, the population of people would have been a lot less than they might have been in relationship to the Mongongo nuts in the world. And so, although I think it is important that what Richard Lee's work did in relationship to hunters and gatherers, Robert Gordon and others have argued that in some ways what he was describing was not necessarily these isolated peoples who were hunting and gatherings, but people who had been pushed into an underclass and were still participating in the capitalist system, but had been mythologized as these sort of isolated primitive hunters and gatherers. Now, there's been a lot of arguments about to what extent this is true, but I think the big point is you always have to keep in mind the larger historical interconnections between people, and especially with the transformations in the last few hundred years, which have led us to industrialized agriculture. So, I think one of the reasons I didn't want us to write web comments on this part is because it can become pretty depressing if we think about the big issues here, probably the production of food and how to feed the people on the planet in a way that can be sustainable is one of our largest issues. It has issues of implications of our individual and collective health, but it also has a huge amount of climate issues, climate implications as well, the implications of industrialized farming, the methane implications just from our cows that we're raising. It's a huge issue. Now, on the kind of positive side of this, there has been a lot of resurgence in people trying to return to local foodways, and in fact, many of the people in the Oneonta area, many of your fellow Hartwick professors and colleagues and staff are very interested in this idea of, the farmers market, the community supported agriculture, how we're going to source our food and paying attention to where it's coming from. We talked, I think, 2 classes ago about the idea of rewilding, so trying to consume more foods that are whole in their more wild state, and to get us away from the highly processed foods that people usually get a lot of their calories from. There are also people who are trying to, of course, get their coffee from fair trade sources or from organic sources, and are trying to trace out the ways and the connections between what we're putting on our plates and putting into our cups and the people who are producing and trading those things. And so I think there's a lot of encouraging signs around these issues, but I think I would also say we have to pay attention to the power relationships, which is what Sidney Mintz and Eric Wolf and Robert Gordon were trying to, in some ways, tell us, is that just the issue still seems to be that the people who can most afford that organic fair trade coffee, well, I guess I would say the people who are consuming that are generally the people who have more power and money in a society. So sure, somebody like me, I'm buying my fair trade coffee, but when we look at the bigger picture, and we look at where Dunkin' Donuts is getting their coffee and where most people are getting their calories, that hasn't changed as much as we would like it to. A lot of that is still being produced in very industrialized and very unequal conditions. A lot of the coffee comes from Brazil, which has some pretty harsh conditions sometimes for people who work in these places. So Although there, and I think we need to encourage those green shoots of people who are thinking about rewilding and these things. It can't just be something for the top or the elite. We have to figure out ways to make this sustainable all the way down.